Well, welcome back, everyone. Today I'm honored to be joined by Mr. Brent Pinkall. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So we'll jump right in. You were involved for quite a while in mission work in China. How'd you get involved there, and what were you kind of doing over there?
Yeah, so I initially went over there in first time visiting China was not in grad school, undergrad school. I had an exchange program and figured China. I don't know anything about China. I have a couple of Chinese friends. Why not? And first visit, just kind of fell in love with the culture. Found it very intriguing. Really wanted to learn the language, and so that planted the first seed. Through the course of my undergrad degree, I participated in a class called Perspectives. At the time, it was called Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. I think they've changed it to something else, something about perspectives still. But and this course, they hold it around the country. Different churches can host it, and they bring in a missionary from the field every week, a different missionary. So you basically just go there and hear missionary stories every week, and was gripped by that. Really had developed a passion for bringing the gospel to the unreached, and I learned that China and brace yourself, Chinese people are not all the same. In fact,
As shocking as that may be for
yeah,
Americans.
right. And in fact, Chinese people are different than Japanese people and Korean people. All Asians are not
Yes.
the same.
And a lot of the Asians hate each other.
Yes, they do. Yes, in fact, you'll find some of the well, I'm going to put that on. We might come back to that later.
Put that on a burner.
Yeah, put that on the back burner for now. But anyway, I learned about the different people groups that were in China, and specifically some Muslim minority groups, and they seem to be kind of the least, some of the least reached in China. So I initially, after graduating from my undergrad school, I went to China with the goal of church planting among these Chinese Muslims, and throughout the course of my time there, kind of got a feeling for my calling, transitioned to Christian education, and around that time too, I discovered classical Christian education, and wanted to help bring that over to China, and so partnered with Chinese church to do that.
And how were you, as an American, allowed to teach, and especially teach Christianity in China, which is an extremely non-Christian, at least
Yeah.
from the top down?
Yeah, so I wasn't technically allowed.
Okay.
So kind of was doing what I was not allowed to do. As ministers of the gospel, we don't seek
Often
permission.
do.
We don't seek permission. But of course, permission is nice, and we don't try and be disagreeable either. But initially, so I got a student visa, and so my visa was, learning Chinese, and then leading Bible studies and whatnot on the side. Even after I graduated from my Chinese studies, I got teaching jobs in public schools, public universities, and even in those classes, you'd be surprised at how much you can get away with. Just framing everything as American culture. Christianity is American culture, and so there's ways of even ministering to students in through my public university job. But eventually, I did begin working in a Christian school, which is not sanctioned by the government, and I don't want to go into details here about how I was able to do that. But you do have to jump through a lot more hoops.
Yes, you have to be, I would imagine, much more careful.
Yes.
Yeah. What was it about the culture that kind of you fell in love with when you first arrived?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, the people. Chinese people, brace yourselves, are different from Americans, and there are certainly aspects of it that you have to, of their culture that maybe are uncomfortable to us.
Yeah.
But one thing, there's a Chinese word, 热情, which is like warm feeling, is like a literal translation, and it describes basically this kind of Chinese hospitality, especially toward foreigners. They're much more, in many ways, much more friendly toward foreigners than toward each other. So as a foreigner, at least at the time, things have gotten a little bit different now, but anywhere you go, it's just like everybody wants to be your friend, inviting you to their homes, and treating you to all these meals every time you go out. Just very warm, open, eager to learn about you. No perceived agenda besides just becoming friends. Of course, besides the people, the food is incredible. I'm not a big fan of American Chinese food.
No,
but
genuine Chinese food.
Yes,
is something else.
Chinese food. Man, and I've spent, since coming back from China, I've put a lot of work into trying to replicate it, and I still can't. It's still just not the same. The Chinese history is also really fascinating. They like to boast that they have the oldest continual culture, 5,000-year culture. That's a disputed claim, but really, really fascinating history, filled with this. So they were, a illiterate culture. So they've got all kinds of, as somebody involved in classical education. I mean, I'm fascinated by the ancient Chinese texts, writings, and the whole Confucian tradition. I think it's really admirable in a lot of ways. A lot of crazy stories. I mean, one of my favorites, the first emperor of China. We know where his tomb is today. In fact, the terracotta warriors. I don't know if you've seen the the thousands of statues that were discovered. Those were discovered around his tomb. Those are basically guarding his tomb. The tomb itself. So this emperor, when he came to power, he burned. He was anti-Confucian, so he burned all of the Confucian texts. But rumor has it he kept copies in his tomb, and as well as all kinds of other treasures. And the records indicate that it's all booby-trapped, and that there's rivers of mercury, and so on and so forth. And initial scientific tests have found mercury inside, but nobody's gone inside because they're afraid of the booby traps. Maybe it'll, if there are all these texts that, just think of this wealth of knowledge that we don't have access to now, that we would have access to if we could gain access to the tomb. But it's, scientists are afraid they might lose it all if they, don't go in it. So we have this, we know where the tomb is. It's like Indiana Jones. And so there's just so many stories like that you just can't look away. So yeah, Chinese culture is really fascinating.
And they're proud of their heritage.
Yes. Well, depends who you say they are. So the Communist Party in recent years, so when soon after they came to power, they sort of propagated this campaign to destroy the four. They called destroy the four olds. It's like old culture, old ideas, old customs, and I forget the fourth one. And so they were very much. They just attributed all of China's problems to this sort of Confucian tradition. So destroy it all. Let's start anew. That went really bad. Led to the Cultural Revolution. And but in recent years, they've did a 180. Now they're trying to basically promote traditional Chinese culture in all kinds of ways. And because of that, and some other reasons we can get into, the church, Chinese Christians, especially conservative Christians on the whole, are quite anti-Confucian, anti-traditional Chinese culture. They're much more attracted to sort of Western culture. They associate that with Christianity more, and so part of my mission serving in China was helping them to see God's common grace in their own classical tradition. Like to be a Chinese, to have classical Christian education in China, you don't have to just cookie cut,
It
the
doesn't
Western
have to be
school.
Greek.
Yeah, yeah, right. And they're raising up Christians to bring Christ into Chinese culture, and like they can't do that if all they know is Western culture. And so, but it takes a lot of persuasion and patience to help them to see the glories of
that there will be a Chinese flavor of Christianity. That it's not just we're not slapping Western culture on top of them.
Exactly.
We're slapping Christianity on top of them.
Exactly.
Which is different.
Yep.
What caused that shift from the government to kind of, let's 180, go back to the old traditions and things?
Yeah. So, unsurprisingly, it's political. So after the Cultural Revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong basically cut off Western powers. And so there was this big divide between the West and China. After the Cultural Revolution, people kind of realized this was a bad problem. The U.S. came in. Nixon was a big figure here, and sort of tried to reestablish relationships. And so there was a period where like the Chinese government, the Chinese people realized actually market economy and various aspects of Western culture and Western governments can actually help us recover from this. So they were very warm and welcoming. When you get into after the 2000s, then China starts to feel threatened by Western powers, American dominance, and wants to sort of establish themselves as independent. We don't need you guys. And so this nationalist sort of movement arose, and the recovering of the Chinese classical tradition is basically a way to say, look, our classical tradition is even longer than yours, and we have our own philosophy, we have our own language, we have our own history. We don't need any of you guys. And so it's just this attempt to kind of flex their muscles on the world stage to see, look how great and wonderful we are. The 2008 Olympics were in Beijing. I don't know if you've seen the opening ceremony.
It was nuts.
Phenomenal. My favorite opening ceremony.
Way better than last year's. I'll tell you that much.
It's phenomenal. But like there was a lot of politics in that, and that was kind of the start of this
show of power. Yeah,
and it's only gotten greater and greater, and in some ways worse and worse, because the image they're portraying is, of course, censored heavily in favor of the CCP. So
it feels a little bit like Nazi Germany. Look how great we are.
Yep.
And in the background doing our own thing.
It's very similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that hospitality warmth they have towards foreigners. That feels like a more Christian attribute of a culture, to be warm towards outsiders. Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. Even though, of course, it is a Christian attribute, it's also deeply embedded in in Chinese classical culture. The Confucian tradition actually promotes studying foreign lands, and I forget the exact phrase, but speaking of the 2008 Olympics, when I can't remember what they were doing on the field. There was like I don't know, some kind of formation or something where they were spelling out. I think they were unrolling a scroll. That's right. They unrolled this giant scroll, and on the scroll was written this phrase from Confucius, which is how does it go? It's something like when when a friend visits from far away, how wonderful it is, or something like that. And so this idea of 热情, this warm hospitality, was long promoted, not just among, be friendly and hospitable toward your own people, but learn from others who aren't like you. And that was corrupted throughout different parts of Chinese history. But of course, as Christians, we have to acknowledge that non-Christian cultures still have remnants of God's grace, right? They're still made in the image of God, still have common grace, and that's some of the most thrilling. To me, that's the most thrilling. One of the most thrilling things of studying Chinese culture, Chinese history, is finding those bright points. One of my favorite Chinese philosophers, his name was Mozi. He lived, I think, around like 300 BC or so, and he has some texts describing the nature of heaven, and capital H heaven, so the power who controls all things, and he presents arguments like why he's all loving and all powerful, and he gives power to the emperor, and so on and so forth. It's really remarkable what God can reveal to people just through natural revelation alone, and so that comes out in things like hospitality.
Yeah, without even knowing the name of Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
just being able to see that
it's the law written on their hearts.
It's amazing. Yeah. As far as the culture itself, how did it change throughout your time there, especially with the rapid urbanization of China?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I first went to China in 2008, and there was the Olympics year, which was really crazy. They were super open to foreigners, as one can imagine. They're hosting the Olympics,
right?
And so one of the, speaking about warm feelings, one of the clearest sort of changes that has happened is a dislike of foreigners. There's still a lot of Chinese people who will welcome you, but a lot more cold toward foreigners, toward foreign influence, in large part because of this propaganda campaign, this nationalist propaganda campaign. And of course, like Trump, when he first came to power, created quite a bit of friction with the Chinese. Chinese are the bad guys, are trying to, do this and that. And you can imagine that the average Chinese person wouldn't take kindly to that.
Yes.
So this whole CCP nationalist campaign has done a lot to sort of shift sentiment toward foreigners, especially Westerners. The authoritarianism has gotten much worse. So the current ruler, Xi Jinping, I can't remember which year he came into power. It was after the opening the 2008 Olympics. He has steadily cracked down on basically anything anti-CCP. So you find this has taken all kinds of crazy forms. So the Communist Party is, by definition, by creed, non-Christian, atheistic, and so you've seen a purge of all Christian influence. For example, a few years ago, one thing that kind of made the news is banning Christmas, and so you see like Grinch-like, police officers like going into malls and taking out Christmas trees, and trying to recover traditional Chinese holidays, so Spring Festival instead of Christmas, that's more aesthetics, but certainly the churches have seen a lot more persecution. So when I first went to China, the although by law, Christians were required. So by law, there's technically freedom of religion. You just have to worship in the government-approved churches. And as you can imagine, we call these the three self. So the three self church is 三字教会, three self, and these are theologically quite liberal, completely controlled by the CCP. You're not allowed to, preach against any communist ideology or policy. And even so, conservative Christians for a long time were tolerated. When I was there, they were tolerated. The government knew that these sort of house churches existed, but didn't really enforce anything. You just kind of meet quietly and do your own thing. Well, that's since changed. There's been a big crackdown on those churches, especially Christian schools, which, Christian education is quite a new thing. Even when I first went there, you didn't find any Chinese churches starting Christian schools. It was more just send them to the government schools and then educate them at home.
Yeah.
And then some churches that I worked with were kind of on the front lines of this. They tried to push the boundaries. So like they're tolerating us. Why not try and exert even greater influence on the culture? So they started trying to create these Christian schools, which were tolerated for a time, and then just the hammer came down hard, and churches were closed, schools were closed, pastors put in prison, house arrest, and that's essentially why I was kicked out as well. So now it's much more difficult. I've got a lot of, I know a lot of Chinese Christians who've left the country just so that they can worship more freely somewhere else, and it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, has the persecution of the Christians ramped up or ramped down since the time that you've been there?
Yeah,
it sounds like it's ramped up.
Absolutely ramped up.
Yeah, and is it more persecution by, like, you're not allowed to go to church, you're not allowed to, or are they actually putting people in jail, killing them, torturing them?
Yeah,
things like that?
not the killing and torturing, not so much. Certainly not the killing. I do have friends who've been tortured in various ways. But it's primarily, so the way that they crack down on these is they find, there's a handful of really influential unregistered Chinese churches. Traditionally we call them house churches, but that you shouldn't think of like meeting in a house. They would rent office spaces or large buildings, and so CCP generally likes to make a show. They pick a few people, make a show of them as like a warning.
Right.
And so that's what's happened. So you have a handful of influential pastors who have been imprisoned. The one that I worked closest with, Wang Yi, is still in prison. He's sentenced to 9 years in prison. And others are, what's quite common, every week I'll find, I am in different social media circles in China, and usually every week some pastor somewhere has been jailed, but it's they put on called administrative arrest. So it's I think it's 14 days is the limit, and then beyond that you have to change the charges. That's quite common, and so they'll put elders, leaders, deacons on that to kind of scare them. But for most Christians, they just essentially remove the means of worshiping. So they will, whatever space you're worshiping in, they go find the landlord of that space and then threaten the landlord and say, "Hey, look, you have some Christians worshiping here. It's an illegal religious gathering. We're going to fine you exorbitant amount of money if you continue to host them." And so they get kicked. So they basically get kicked out of their space, get kicked out of their homes. In some extreme situations, so you have Chinese Christians trying to homeschool their children instead of sending them to public school. So I've got friends where the Bureau of Education, along with the police, will come knocking at your door, say, "Look, we know your child's not in school. If you don't send them to school, we're going to take your children from you." And you can imagine that's quite effective. and jobs. So there's this pressure on employers. So if somebody's attending an unregistered church, they will go to their employer and say, "Hey, look, your employee here is part of a cult, and you should fire them." And so they get fired. And so there's all these different pressures where it's not arresting them necessarily, but making it really hard for them to worship.
To go about their day-to-day lives, especially.
Yep.
Yeah. We'll talk about the CCP later. I'm curious, how did you, as you're instructing these Chinese students, kind of use the culture that they have and the traditions that they have to point to Christ?
Yeah. So in Chinese culture, I think it's much easier in Chinese culture than some other cultures, just because I think God's hand was especially strong in Chinese culture, especially prevalent. So the first, I think there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but it's interesting looking at the Chinese Bible. The Bible that is used by, unlike like America now, you'll find it's not uncommon to find Christian. There's probably maybe four Bible translations that are maybe 95% of Americans use. About Protestants at least use maybe NIV, ESV, KJV. I don't know. There's a few others, NASB. In Chinese Christianity, I would say, venture to guess, maybe 95% or more of Christians just use one Bible translation. It's called the Chinese Union Version. And when you read that, you will find that there's a lot of traditional words and concepts that are used. So just to give an example here, in the Gospel of John in English begins, "In the beginning was the Word." In Chinese, it begins, "In the beginning was the Tao." Tao, or sometimes spelled Tao, Tao, is a traditional Chinese concept of this force that, very much like the Logos in Western culture, that creates everything, is in some ways in everything. It's the path, the way. It's got this moral component that you follow the Tao, you follow the way, and so the Chinese Bible translators are drawing from these concepts and saying, Jesus is actually the Tao. And so I begin with scripture, and the word Shangdi, and so there's the Chinese Bibles. There's kind of two versions of the Bible. Some call God Shangdi, some call him Shen. Both of these words are traditional Chinese words. Shangdi is quite interesting. It's literally emperor on high, and it's a word that was used in Confucius's day. Confucius himself sometimes refers to God as Shangdi. And so I begin with just kind of these references to Tao and Shangdi. How were they, your ancestors aware of this God, like that there is a God over everything to whom we're subject to, and so you start there, and of course you bring in Bible verses about God writes the law on the hearts of Gentiles who don't have the law. Romans 1 is helpful, and so you can bring in sort of theological arguments like of common grace and so on and so forth, and like I mentioned just Moza a little bit ago, there's all kinds of writings that directly discuss and speculate about the nature of God, and of course as a sinner is trying to utilize common grace, general revelation to look into the nature of God, he's going to make mistakes. And I told you that Chinese Christians are generally quite skeptical of Chinese classical tradition. One of the reasons for this is because there's a lot of sin in the tradition.
Right.
There's a lot of error. Even like with Tao, like you can find Taoist writings like that say something about the Tao that's not true of Jesus, and they say, see, they didn't understand, and so these differences are just as fruitful for discussing Chinese classical culture as sort of the similarities, and so the way I kind of paint it. Sometimes I'll use the image of the paralytic. So Jesus heals a few different paralytics, but the one where he says, "Take up your mat and walk." So you have this. You just imagine a paralytic who can see. So that when you look at the Chinese tradition, you have these very lofty sayings about the importance of righteousness and living your life not for personal gain, and all these great moral commands. Many of the first Protestant missionaries in China were just blown away by how dead on the morality of this Confucian tradition was. They said it's so much more moral than the Western. Like look at ancient Greek tradition and the difference is night and day. Like they have a very keen sense of sort of what is right and what is wrong, and we should pursue what is right. The problem is you find all kinds of hypocrisy, all kinds of people pretending to be right, and even in the Confucian writings you have these warnings against don't be hypocrite, but nobody can live up to that. And so it's like the paralytic. He sees these vast mountain ranges and the beautiful sunset and these green pastures, and he's confined to this mat. And Jesus comes and says, "Take up your mat and walk," and allows him to go run in those pastures. And so, right. So that's kind of how I like the general painting is the Chinese classical tradition shows us what to aspire to, but doesn't give us the power to achieve that. Christ comes and gives us the power to live like we ought.
Yeah.
So that's one way. There's a lot of other things we could discuss.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it does seem, at least from an American's perspective, that the Greeks and the Europeans seemed a little more chaotic in their trek towards Christianity, whereas the Chinese have, without necessarily the influence of Christianity directly, have seemed a lot more regimented, straightforward, less crazy. Even we'll talk about this later, but Red Note, the new social media app that's taken hold as the banning of TikTok commences, has been banning LGBTQ and trans influencers. Not because they are like alt-right, it's just they're like, no, this is wrong. Yep. And we understand this is wrong.
Yep.
And it's fascinating.
Yes.
It also seems from an American's perspective that the Chinese culturally are a lot more industrious and productive person to person than Americans are. Yep. There are some Americans who are extremely industrious and productive, and there are also some who are extremely not that way. It seems like the Chinese are a little more like everyone is going the right direction. Is that true?
Well, everyone's going the right direction. That's an interesting way to phrase that. I wouldn't phrase it that way. Everyone's going the right direction. As far as the industry goes, absolutely. All the factories are in China, right? Like that. Why is that? It's not just economically beneficial. Like there is something in the modern Chinese outlook which is very materialistic. So it's important to note that there's a in my view there's a great tension between sort of classical Chinese the classical Chinese tradition and modern Chinese sentiments. So like the CCP is like destroying the four olds, like the Cultural Revolution. Like it's all about leaving all that behind, bringing in this new atheistic, materialistic, scientific culture, and so this has led to a culture that is eager to produce. I mean, just look at like how fast they build a building.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's like in a week they got a skyscraper.
Yeah.
From nothing, and so it's produce, earn money. I was gonna say have kids.
But that's not so true.
That's not so true. We can talk about that, but it's basically earn money, grow in wealth and stature and reputation, and hopefully pass that on to your child. And so and there is an element in the Confucian tradition. Confucius said basically he doesn't speculate about gods because it's hard enough to understand man. And so you'll find, he'll reference God, he'll reference heaven and talk about it's important to kind of respect heaven. But the Confucians were very much just concerned about human affairs. The Buddhists, when Buddhism entered China in like 680 or so, they're the ones who kind of bring this spiritual side of things. But of course, in Buddhism, Buddhism is quite antithetical to the Christian understanding of God, and there was a lot of tension even between Confucius's understanding of God, and then you have this polytheistic sort of culture where there's all these gods everywhere. And this has, but even so, even with this sort of Buddhist influence, it's the average Chinese person is not concerned about the universals, the universal questions, sort of course, God himself. And this is actually one of the reasons why the scientific revolution never happened in China. There was a famous British scientist who spent many years in China in the what year was that? Maybe like the 50s and 60s. I'm trying to remember his name now. He wrote this monumental volume on the history of science in China, and he asked this question of like, why didn't the scientific revolution take off in China? And he pinpoints it to the fact that they didn't worship a god that they saw as sort of sovereign over all, logical, and personal with man. They did back in the days of Confucius. I think there's a strong case to be made that God is a personal God, but especially after the Buddhists came, he got depersonified into this just kind of vague force. And it's because of the personal nature of God that we are made in the image of God, and therefore, the God's creation is intelligible to us, that allows us to do science in the first place. And so the Chinese aren't thinking about the universal questions now. It's very much just, how can I feed my family today? How can I make a little bit more money? And it's actually quite sad, and this is something that the Chinese church is really trying to, this void that they're trying to fill. And of course, the technocratic sort of AI revolution that's happening in China right now is only exacerbating the problem. It's a really sad place to live for the average person. There's little hope, and especially, I mean, even marriage and children. Like, nobody's having children. There was the one-child policy at one point where the government said, don't have any more children. They thought it was a bad thing, and now they're trying to get people to have children, and nobody's wanting to have children.
Right.
because, well, that's just a financial burden, and I'd rather just live the rest of my life just being merry, and because tomorrow I die. And so it's that's the although they're very good, very industrious, they're not on the whole, I think, innovative, because because you have to take risks. You have to have a vision to be innovative, right? You have to be looking forward, and not care so much about living a good life now. It's the better life then, and it's really hard for a lot of Chinese people to kind of get beyond the this lifeness
and be extremely creative.
Yes.
Which is difficult in a cookie cutter society.
Yes.
This is one of the things that people have somewhat been skeptical about with the military, is like people coming in and out of the military. They go in a little more creative and then they come out as a soldier. And they lose that creativity and spark that makes people go do and innovate and do amazing things.
But it is, I mean, to be fair, I mean, there is a glory in like the military, like watching military drills, everybody doing the same thing.
Oh yeah,
like
it's beautiful, and the Chinese are really good at it.
Yes, I mean the opening ceremonies. There's
unbelievable.
My favorite part of that was they had like, I don't know, hundreds of these ancient drums.
Yes,
and everybody is in the choreography is just
perfectly
synced.
It's
so cool.
Unbelievable.
But that has downsides as well.
Yeah. And there are good things to that industriousness. Like I would like to feed my family. I'd provide for them not only today but in the long term. How does that aspect of the Chinese culture become saved?
Yeah, that's great. So, of course, we don't want to. You're right. We don't want to look at that industriousness and say, "Oh, poor Chinese." Like, there's good here,
right?
But it's it's directed toward bad ends, right? So it's, the Apostle Paul tells us to set our mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth, and so we keep the industriousness, that desire to produce, and even that desire to seek glory and wealth, but the glory we point them to is not your own glory. We seek the glory of God, and in some sense we even do seek our own glory, but we seek the approval not of men but of God,
right?
And we want to be praised by Him, and so you lean into those things. Yes, produce like that building you just made in a week. What if that was a church? How many churches don't have I mean, almost hardly. I mean, unregistered churches, basically nobody has buildings now. Imagine if one day there was a change in the heart of Xi Jinping, or the CCP fell, Christianity was made legal. Imagine how many churches would pop up the next day.
I know.
That would be, just church buildings.
Within a week,
be
populated.
But even in this, of course, this environment, I mean, using that industriousness to love and serve others, it's in some ways American Christians, I think, can learn from. Like, in many ways, American culture is, especially young people today, are not industrious. It's sort of, just I don't want to do the hard job, the low paying job. I demand high pay and a good job without any experience, because I deserve the good life. And or an education, there's, compare any Chinese student with elementary school student with any Chinese American elementary school student, and the differences are quite stark as far as industriousness is concerned. But yeah, it's about redirecting the ends. So keeping the skills and the desires, but changing the ends toward that they're pursuing with them.
Yeah. As far as the Chinese Christians over there, what things are they facing that American Christians over here may not even understand?
Yeah. So, um, I think in America, when we think of, certainly American Christians, when we think of Chinese Christians, we still have a vision of um, cultural revolution China, of Christians under, physical threat, tortures, imprisonments. And I just told you all kinds of ways that people are being imprisoned. So there's some truth to that these days, but um, the persecution on the one hand is on the whole a softer form of persecution, not softer in the sense of
It's easier.
well, it's less obvious. You can't take a photo of it.
Yeah.
And so there's these institutional pressures. You can't find a job. Like, how do you it's hard for us to appreciate that that kind of persecution. I can't find a job. It's like, oh, I'm sorry. But it doesn't really move us like watching, seeing somebody tortured.
Right.
The other thing is, and this is probably more important, I would say most Chinese Christians, just the average Chinese Christian, if you ask them, talk to them, oh, I'm so sorry about that you're persecuted. They're going to say, what? Like, I'm not persecuted, because they are ignorant of the persecution that a lot of their brothers and sisters are experiencing. China is a very large country, and the persecution comes from local authorities. So it's local governments are given freedom basically to determine the level of persecution, how they're going to go about shutting down these churches, what degree of influence they're going to impose upon them. And so every place is different. And I've encountered many Chinese Christians kind of look flummoxed when somebody suggests that Christians are being jailed in China. What? No, that's not happening. There's a church.
I'm not being jailed.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone that's being jailed.
Right. And, a lot of these are going to the government-approved churches too. And so, they have church buildings with Red Cross on it. And so the average person sees that and says, oh, we have Christianity in China. It's just, and so it's much more diverse. And there are a lot of Christians that aren't being persecuted. But one of probably the biggest challenge to even those that are being persecuted is not the persecution. So you talk to them and you say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm praying that the persecution would stop. And I've heard a lot of Chinese Christians say, I don't really care so much about the persecution. Like, my church, if I've talked to a pastor, my flock, my people are, they're getting divorced. I have young men are struggling with pornography. It's all of these sort of common things that our churches, that we're dealing with, and they simply lack the ability to shepherd them well. They don't have. Nobody wants to take leadership roles in Chinese churches because of the persecution. Yeah. You have the love of the world, all this industriousness, the pursuit of wealth, like that tugs at the heartstrings, and so there's the real fight, I think, in China right now. It's not ending persecution. It's ministering to the people of God. Developing healthy families, healthy marriages. This is why I'm so passionate about Christian education in China, because that's huge, and it's something that's easily neglected, and it comes with a lot of. You have to give up a lot to to homeschool your child or go to Christian school instead of the government school system, and it just puts a lot of strain on relationships, on friendships, on marriages, and so I think Americans would do well to pray for just the basic sort of Christian life side of the help these Christians to live a purposeful holy life in this
Trying time.
Yeah.
Yeah. In your estimation, how many Chinese Christians are there? Because the government does its good job to censor that information.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is the government has released official numbers of so they have their own, and of course they're just polling the officially approved churches.
Yeah.
This is in Chinese studies, religious studies. Like this is a very contentious question. You find wild estimations. I think a good maybe and again I'm just guessing here. There's about 10 different studies I've read on this question. I think it's my own experience 2 to 3%, maybe 3 to 4% of Chinese people are Christians. There is some degree of cultural Christianity in China, but it's you'll find a lot of sympathizers to Christianity at times, but they maybe wouldn't identify as Christian. So I think it's 1.4 billion people is the population of China right now. So that's still a lot.
It's getting to 50 million.
Yeah, it's a lot. They've got a presence, but it's still very much unchristianized. And although the Han Chinese is the like 80% of Chinese are Han Chinese, that's really where Christianity has taken root. And so any big city, you can find multiple churches, government approved churches and house churches. And in fact, the Bible, you hear about Bible smugglers in China. The largest Bible publisher is in China. It's government approved. Bibles can only be sold through the government approved churches. But it's even though a few years ago they banned the online sale of Bibles, you can still go to any government approved church and you can buy Bibles there. So other kinds of Christian literature is much harder these days to get. But yeah, it's still a lot of work to do, especially among minority groups. And whether it's growing or not is another question. You hear you'll hear some American Christians say, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and so yeah, there's persecution, but I'm sure they're thinking because in Cultural Revolution this was the case. There was severe persecution, and out of that time the church just numbers exploded.
Right. So
some people are kind of imposing that onto these days and say, look, all the persecution is coming, numbers are going to skyrocket, and I suspect they're actually going down because of the persecution. And I just heard, I read not too long ago an article by a Chinese pastor who was basically admonishing American Christians from like speaking of persecution as a good thing. Like, no, actually, people really do leave church because of it. Like churches are shrinking, and so these are trying times.
Yeah. Were you there when Trump was elected in office?
I was actually here at grad school, so I spent a few years in China. When I wanted to come to sort of change direction to classical Christian education, I came to grad school here at New St. Andrews, and that's when he was elected. But then I went back, and so I was in China when he was president.
What changes did you notice?
Yeah, that's interesting. So because that was his first term, his first presidency, and he, if you remember, he kind of made an enemy out of China.
Yes, he did. There were a lot of China memes.
Yeah, and so when I went back, I'd get a lot of taxi drivers asking me about Trump, and I would ask them about Trump, and Trump is, in some ways, he's a likable character, just because he's so crazy. He's memeable, right? And so like Chinese young people have a good laugh at him. But the more clear-headed sort of older people, we're not were not pleased. And even after I went back to China, like before I was kicked out, I noticed a very clear sort of shift. Chinese Christians, on the other hand, generally see him as friendly to Christianity.
Yep.
And so, on the whole, I think Chinese Christians are quite pleased with him. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it was wise of Trump to make an enemy of China?
Well, yeah, that's a loaded question. I'm thankful wherein Trump has identified real threats. I'm thankful he does that. I'm not an expert in like geopolitical affairs, and that's all very complicated. And it's like what's interesting about Trump is, one day China's like the worst totalitarian regime in the history of America, and then the next day Xi Jinping is his good friend, and so there's all kinds of politics going on there. But I do think so he was when I was kicked out of China, his administration was very friendly to Chinese Christians and the persecution that they were under. I won't go into details, but I did have a number of discussions with. I probably shouldn't talk about that, but Trump's attitude toward China at the time did help, I think, American government on the whole, to get a clearer picture of the real threats that exist there, not just to America, but to other Chinese people. And that's a good thing. That can go off the rails at times, can sort of devolve into racism, frankly. And so I think as Christians, we need to be able
not be racist.
Yeah, not be racist. We need to be able to, frankly acknowledge cultural differences. And I think there is such a thing as cultural sins. I mean, we just talked about some today. Like, I think they have some propensities. We have our own propensities. But, that shouldn't, the fact that the Chinese regime is doing X, Y, Z, like, shouldn't change how you treat that Chinese guy on the street, that the Chinese international student.
Right.
You should still show just as much.
They're still human.
Yeah, they're still human. They're still made in the image of God, and we should go talk to him, invite him to lunch. But you have things like the TikTok ban. I don't know when this is going to air, but yesterday, I think it was, the Supreme Court just ruled that they uphold the TikTok ban. Whether that's going to happen has yet to be seen. But the Supreme Court at least has said, "Yep, we need to ban TikTok." Well, I guess the Congress said that, and Supreme Court said yes, that's permissible. Now, is that justified? I have questions, like, to what degree does the CCP control TikTok? Even if they control it, to what degree are they using it for nefarious purposes? Like, that's all a mystery. I can't look into, crystal ball. But it is easy to say, this is Chinese influence, just get it out, get away. And there's a sort of a xenophobia that can be harmful. You cut off trade relationships. I think there's value to TikTok. If it goes away,
there's pros and cons.
Yeah, there's pros and cons. I mean, I don't really care too much about it, but that's just an example of, or the Chinese manufacturers. Even the Trump tariffs, Trump's trying to get everything made in here. And I think there's advantages to that.
Absolutely, especially for technology, which is one of the big things.
Yeah.
We have a lot of our communication devices built over in China.
Yes.
Which is not great.
Yes. And so there's certainly wisdom in that. But like when I look back, I think there's some parallels to like the Cold War, and like everything Russian is bad. And people are looking over their shoulders, and there's the whole communist purge, the McCarthy stuff. Like, was that good for America? Like, I'll just say I think we went too far, and so I want to be cautious of going too far, and so that's Trump, if he has any propensity, it's to go too far. He's a man of hyperbole, and sometimes his followers don't understand that, and so that's the only caution I have. But I'm very thankful, on the whole, that he's been very vocal, pointing out those the real threats of China, and I just, as a Christian, my allegiance is to Christ ultimately, and so. I don't want China to become America. I want it to become the best China it can be,
right,
under the lordship of Christ. And sometimes I think even American Christians can lose sight of that, and it's just American dominance all the way. And so that's where I draw the line.
Yeah,
I want to be. Yeah, I want my country to be healthy and well protected, but I also want other countries to be healthy and well protected, and to be who God made them to be.
Yeah, I love the idea of Christians taking over a culture so that it remains partly itself.
Yes.
But with Christianity like embedded as the foundation.
Yes.
It sounds much more wonderful than everyone being a cookie cutter.
Yes. I like the just the picture of like a garden.
Yes.
So like we have our own soil, we have our own flora, our own flowers, and so on and so forth, that are distinct to our culture, and we don't want to just dig up those flowers and transplant them into Chinese.
Yes.
So like Chinese they have their own trees and
they've
their
got
own
bamboo,
flowers, and
we love
bamboo
that.
forests. Yeah, what would the world be without bamboo forests, right?
I know.
No pandas. So yes, and of course you see that in Revelation, the book of Revelation too, when we have that glimpse into heaven and people from all tribes and tongues and nations worshiping God together. Like there's still clear distinctions there. Everybody's not just one tongue now, and that's the glory of God.
Yeah. As far as the CCP goes, how did they get into power?
Yeah, so they came to power in 1949, and the way that came about was, so before them, the Nationalist Party was in control, Kuomintang in Chinese. And so this was like during World War II, Nationalist Party was in control, but there was, the CCP was actually quite, so they arose during this time and really helped in many ways to fight the Japanese. So they kind of won a lot of support there. But then there was the short version is there was a lot of corruption in the Nationalist Party, especially these landowners and warlords who exerted this a lot of influence and were more or less persecuting the average peasants, and so the communists kind of stirred up this sentiment against the landowners, and which people associated with the communist with the Nationalist Party. And so then this began after the World War II, a civil war between the communists and the Nationalist Party. And there's this great march, is what it's called, that Mao Zedong led the communists up on this big long march. A lot of people died, but to go attack the nationalists, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. So that's how we get Taiwan. So basically, communists come to power, Nationalist Party flees to Taiwan, and this is why the CCP now, they say, well, we took over China, And so you can't just flee to another city and say, we're ourselves. No, you still belong to us. And there's like, no, we established our own nation over here. So that's the short of it. And so it was a popular revolt. And so they had a lot of popular support. And
there's a lot of Americans that would like to incorporate communism into our form of government.
Mm-hmm.
While you were over there, were there any benefits you saw to a communist government or no?
That's interesting. I don't know that anybody's asked me that before. Any benefits to a communist government? There is I'll share an anecdote here. When I was arrested, I was interrogated by Chinese police. I went to the police station, an interrogation room with, initially it was a couple police officers. Later they moved me and some officials, angry men, came in and interrogated me, and that was a little bit more. There were more fireworks there, but the police officers were actually quite nice. There was a young man. I'm gonna guess he's maybe only 25. His superior left, and so it was just him and me. And so I thought, why is he asking all the questions? I want to ask him questions because I'm just curious. It's my first time in a Chinese police station. So I was asking him about like life on being a Chinese police officer. Like, do you like it? And he shared a story about he had recently visited California, and he said, in your country, criminals run the streets.
It's unfortunately true of California.
Yeah, and he said it's so dangerous. People are carrying guns, and there's crime everywhere. He's like, walk the streets here, and you won't find any crime on the streets. Of course, he's using a little bit of hyperbole here, but there's some truth to that. Gun ownership is banned,
which is not great.
Which is that comes with its own problems. But I will say, for the average person, there's an appearance of order that gives one peace and assurance. And of course, this is the trappings of it all. Like it's 24/7 propaganda, because any dissenting voices they quickly silence, and so anytime there's friction, they quickly snuff it out. But it does feel a lot less. There's a lot less friction. There's no mass demonstrations on the street, with very few exceptions. Like the COVID stuff, we saw a little bit of that, and that was crazy. But there is an order to a police state. There's an order. Everything, as long as you stay in your lane, things kind of seem to run well. And when things aren't running well, they do a good job of covering it up. They construct these giant walls. Like if there's a poor area of neighborhood where the houses just don't look great, they just construct these giant walls around it so you can't even see it.
Nice.
And so, if you don't think about it too much, you just kind of go along your day like you have a pleasant day. And of course, there's corruption under all of that, but that's nice. There's also just a general kind of collective sentiment, a kind of nationalist sentiment that pride in the nation. It's nice to feel like we're on a team together, right? And that's the communist ideal is that it's we're just one big family sharing everything with each other, and even though in practice that's not how it works, they do a good job at cultivating that sentiment, and so I can get a sense of that. Of course, I'm an informed Christian, and I have Christians on the persecuted side of things, and so I know it's all fake. But I can appreciate the average Chinese person why they would support the Communist Party. All the television is heavily edited. I mean, we as Americans, we hate censorship, but like I wouldn't mind if we just outlawed pornography altogether and
Absolutely. Yeah.
purged the internet of it. And I want very strict censorship in certain points, and the Communist Party does that.
Yeah.
Right. Pornography is inaccessible. Well, it's always accessible through like VPNs and whatnot. But, I can appreciate some of that. But obviously it goes off
There's
the rails
tremendous
quickly.
downsides.
Yes.
Yeah. What was your story getting arrested and what happened there?
Yeah. So the church that I was helping was one of the leaders of this unregistered church movement, especially this openness movement, where they're trying to come out from hiding. They've got website, and publicly advertising where they're meeting. They've got a number of ministries that directly oppose certain CCP agenda items, the anti-abortion ministry where they're out on the streets preaching, holding up signs like you would see here in the U.S., and starting Christian schools, and even bringing like Presbyterian form of government, which was not prevalent. It wasn't really existent in China like during the Cultural Revolution. It was just all very isolated to individual-led churches. So there's this church was very influential, and for that reason, it was one of the biggest ones on the government's target. And so I was helping with a school that they had started, and I would attend their meeting, their Sunday gatherings. I was a member essentially, the only foreigner member. So a lot of eyes were on me, and the government made it no secret that they were watching things. Every Sunday there would be 2 police officers that would come and videotape, and they would just come, and so I just ignored them, and we got by for a while. And then one day in church, more than 2 police officers came. A couple of them walked by, and then a third, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, and then a sixth. And I think there were 8 police officers total. And I was told if there was a raid that I should try to get it away if I could. And so I knew something was off. And so I was close to a door, and I tried to sneak out. And as soon as I left out the door, in the middle of the sermon, those 8 police officers get up and run down the aisle hollering, like, stop, stop, stop. And so they were apparently there for me. And there was a little bit of cat and mouse that went on in the next few days. But eventually they found me and took me to the police station and interrogated me, wanted to find out what I was doing, who all of my acquaintances and students were, and that was all quite interesting. But basically, it was at the police station for the whole day, and they canceled my visa, and
that's why you came back.
That's why I came back.
Yeah. How'd you handle the interrogation? You just dead silent the whole time, I would assume?
No, I wasn't. I was silent about things. So I had gone in there with certain convictions, like I'm not going to incriminate any of my friends. So they asked me questions, who are your students, and like I wouldn't tell them. I'm not going to tell you. But I was genuinely like I wanted information as much as they did, because they're so secretive, and I just want to, this is as a missionary, you kind of dream of this, that this is something you can, at least me, like I heard all these missionary stories, read all these missionary biographies, like now I get like this is gonna be
I get to go to prison.
This is gonna be a good story.
Yes.
And seriously, like I have this morbid curiosity about Chinese prison, and in fact, when the first interrogation room we went into was this concrete room about a quarter of the size of this room. It's quite small, and in the middle of the room is bolted to the floor this metal chair. In Chinese, it's called a tiger chair, but it's looks kind of like an electric chair. It's got all these shackles and everything on it, and this like thing that goes around your waist and locks in. And so, like when I see it, my first thought that runs to mind is like, this is a throne, and like what an honor. I'm sitting here. Like I just envision myself as like a son of God, like sitting on his throne, and these police are here to serve me. And I think there's a biblical case to be made for that, but and then I'm like eager to participate. I have Chinese colleagues who've suffered in various ways, and like I can finally participate in their sufferings, and so I ask them like, are you going to lock me in? And they say, oh no, we're not going to lock you in. And I was kind of disappointed because I was like, I want the whole experience here. But it was quite pleasant, honestly, with those initial police officers. And it wasn't until we took a lunch break, and then as I'm sitting there they have a little courtyard, and I see a group of 4 or 5 old men. One of them like a two-faced, like from Batman. He's got like a big birthmark across half of his face, and they go over to the older police officer who just interrogated me, and they're chatting, and I'm far enough away I can't hear what they're saying, but I try and listen really closely, and all I hear is he is a Christian, and come to find out these guys are the police. There's not a lot of great communication between Chinese authorities, and so my guess is the police, these police officers were just ordered by somebody above, go get this guy, find out what he's doing, and they weren't especially threatened by me, and so I think they were quite pleasant. But these guys were from the Ministry of Ethnic and Religious Affairs, and they're the ones that are really holding the reins on the persecution of this church. And so they took me to another room, and they were the ones who got really heated, and demanding information about who I was helping, what I was doing. I tried to evangelize them, asking, why do you? I can't remember exactly how it went about, but we got to discussing God. I actually talked to them a little bit about like, your ancestors believed in God, like because they think they're CCP. They think it's ridiculous that there's a God, and it's like Confucius himself talks about God, like the God whom he talks about, whom you read about in your textbooks. Like that's who I'm here to proclaim, and they're calling me fool, and one of the guys actually said, my parents are Christians. I was like, wow. So why are you doing this? And so we had a kind of an apologetic exchange for a while, but in the end, the thing is, it would take some really crazy crime for them to first jail me, but especially like torture me, because they know that the American government
is watching.
Yeah, is watching, right? So, and I kind of knew that, and so I kind of leaned into. It's like, well, if I'm gonna go out, like you're not gonna hit me or anything.
A bit of you can't touch me.
Yeah, and it's like I mean I didn't necessarily want to be hit, but I wasn't afraid of being hit, and so I kind of pressed them on a number of things, and rebuked them for the people you're persecuting are the best hope that China has for renewal, national renewal, like all these things you really want, you're destroying the source, the doctors who have the cure for your ailments. And because I was thinking, if I'm going to go out, like I would kick myself if I didn't leave without having directly addressed the persecutors. And so that was rewarding, and I'm really thankful that the Lord gave me that opportunity. But unfortunately,
not able to go to jail.
Yeah.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. But as soon as I got kicked out, then they raided the church and did jail many of the members. And like I said, the main pastor is still in jail. So
yeah, there's a big story about that. I remember a couple of years ago. What's the relationship between the CCP and a lot of the larger corporations in China?
Yeah, that's a good question. So legally, every business has to have what they call a cell. So this essentially a cell, or sometimes a branch they call it, that is connected to the CCP. So basically, they have these cells or branches act as kind of watchdogs, ensuring that the business is holding the line on CCP policy, that they are not violating any rules, that they are paying their taxes. There's a lot of corruption, as you can imagine, and so like if a business wants to do something that's kind of against the law, then they bribe this middleman, basically, that the CCP member, to give them a good record, and so it's a common knowledge that in China you can't do business in China without paying bribes. Bribes are demanded everywhere, and but you can't have a legal business, essentially without welcoming CCP spies, if you will. An eternal CCP presence in your business, and so you can imagine. And I will say that that's the foreign. In recent years, especially, a lot of foreign businesses have left China because of the requirements that they make on these businesses for sharing data, especially, and so you have a lot of, like Facebook has pulled out of China a while ago. You can't, a lot of these businesses don't do business there just because of the demands made on them. That CCP has to control everything.
Yeah.
And so even though there are technically private businesses, there's state-run business, but there are private businesses, but they're not private in the way that American businesses are private. They are puppets in the hands of the CCP, and you can start a business, but not without somebody watching over your shoulder the whole time.
You talked earlier about the birth rate problem a little bit, that people just don't want to have kids at this point. Mm-hmm. They had the one-child policy. Now it's just a lack of motivation. Is that true of all Chinese, or is it are the Chinese Christians kind of exempt from that? Are they flourishing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of those that are having children, they are certainly disproportionately Christian. And the Christians were, when the one-child policy was still in force, those that were breaking it were almost exclusively Christians.
Right.
And so they had the upper hand when it changed to 2-children policy, and then however many you want policy. And so I've got a number of Chinese Christian colleagues that have, I think the most is 3 children of everybody I know. I don't know any Chinese families with more than 3 children. But that is encouraging. I will say still the vast majority of Chinese Christians are like the other Chinese, and don't especially want children, and if they do, like one is all they want.
Right.
But I'm hopeful. I see change, and I mean, even in the secular media, I'm seeing all kinds of warnings of population collapse. Japan's in really bad state now.
Japan, South Korea,
In South Korea, yes. And so I think even non-Christians are kind of recognizing that now. Again, because Chinese are so, just broadly speaking, this is kind of a counterintuitive, but in this communist collectivist society, quite self-centered. And so you won't find a lot of people saying, well, in order to ensure that our nation does not collapse, I'm going to have more children. If you have more children, it's for your own reasons. But I do think you're going to find, even in the broader culture, an increase in childbirth, but it's still at dangerously low levels. And we'll see. I won't be sad if the non-Christians stop having children and leave it to the Christians to populate the nation.
How do you think that will play out? Do you think that there will eventually just become the Chinese will just drop off, or will they start having kids again, or what how do you think that's gonna?
I have no idea. I'm not
sure.
That's beyond my pay grade.
We'll have to see.
Yeah, I'll leave that to Providence.
Yeah.
If I were gonna guess, I think it's going to continue to decline. I think with the sort of again technocratic, I don't know if I'm sure you've read That Hideous Strength.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books.
Okay. China feels very much like the NICE to me.
Yes.
The NICE. And in that kind of society, I can't see human flourishing. And so I think until the CCP, maybe the CCP will make some giant pivot away from that. But it's right now it's all like tech focused. It's all STEM. And one of the things that encourages me about Chinese Christian education right now is in the classical Christian education is, it's trying to recover the humanities. And I think that's going to be a really key ingredient when Chinese people, as they already are start to realize the hell that they're creating. And so my hope actually is just that the CCP will collapse. It's no secret that there are divisions within the CCP. There's kind of two parties. There's like the anti-Xi party and then the pro-Xi party. And I don't necessarily want a revolution like with a lot of bloodshed. But
sometimes that's necessary.
Sometimes at least it happens. Barring a revival, which would be wonderful, a Christian revival, just changing the hearts of men, I think it's going to have to see some really major political upheaval in order to see any huge changes.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why has the CCP not been overthrown yet?
Yeah.
Is it on its way out, in your estimation? Have the beginnings of the earthquake begun?
Yeah, I don't know. I do think certainly COVID was interesting because they came down quite hard on with sort of the pro-masking, and what happened was they initially tried to hide. There's no problem, and then they just did a complete shutdown of the nation, which was detrimental for a lot of reasons, and that led to protests that we haven't seen in a long time. I mean, it's kind of since the whole Hong Kong debacle, and like you just never see. And there were videos of crowds of thousands on the streets chanting down to the CCP.
Yeah.
Which was just crazy. Never thought I'd live to see that day. And so since then, I think the CCP has recovered their image somewhat, but there's a general sentiment among Chinese people that the Chinese economy is not doing well, and it's the future doesn't look great.
A bit of a wake-up moment.
Yeah, and so I think at the very least, I think it's not unlikely that there's demands for Xi to step down, that within the party there's going to be enough pressure to replace him with somebody else. So that's my guess is the next step is Xi gets replaced with somebody a little bit more moderate. And where we go from there, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Switching gears a bit more random. You were on a TV show at one point. Is that correct?
Yes.
How did that come to pass?
Yeah. Well, there was a couple different Chinese TV shows that I was on. The first one was actually a multi-episode Chinese language competition called Chinese Bridge, and it's this international competition. They frame it as a Chinese language competition. It's more like a variety show competition, but there's one that's within China for international students in China, and then one for the broader world. So while I was studying in China, I participated in this, won my province competition, and then I was flown to Beijing for the finals. So that was on national TV, and they have all kinds of, not just language trivia stuff, but you have like skits, and you have to perform talents. And I played saxophone, and so it's like a variety show for entertainment purposes. It's not.
And was it exclusively for foreigners?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. When I was in Africa, all the Africans looked at me like some sort of specimen in a zoo.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And so I lean into that. Some people get really annoyed by that.
I found it hilarious.
Yeah.
And especially you're like 6'7" or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
So
you're wildly above the
being
average
tall.
height.
Yeah. Definitely gets you more eyes. And so I the thing about Chinese TV, it's already quite outrageous. It's not quite as outrageous as Japanese. Like, you watch Japanese game shows or something.
They're nuts.
They're nuts. Yeah,
they're crazy.
It's not quite like that, but it's in that vein. And so like every comedy show has a laugh track over it, and they're like really kind of corny humor, and so I knew how to lean into that, and so that helped. On this show I ended up playing. They gave me a cowboy. There's at one point we had this thing where like everybody's supposed to dress in their native garb, and I was just gonna wear a suit because like we don't. I guess that's our native garb, a Western suit. And they're like, no, America, cowboy. And I'm very much not a cowboy kind of guy.
Yes.
And I was like, well, I don't have any cowboy clothes. And so they go to their wardrobe and they pull out this cowboy outfit that's like for a small Chinese man. And so I thought, nobody's gonna watch this. So
what the heck? Why not?
Heck? Why not? And so like I put on this cowboy outfit, which is like the sleeves come up to like underneath my elbow.
It's gotta be
here.
wildly uncomfortable.
Yes, it was hilarious. And then they had this musical number where they had like 5 different people playing different kinds of drums, and they wanted me to play a drum. I've never played the drums before, and they gave me these like bongo drums. There's like a set of like 4 or 5 bongo drums around my waist.
Yeah.
And they pre-recorded this drum medley thing, and we were supposed to pretend like we're the ones playing it. All Chinese TV is like highly produced, everything's fake, and so like I just leaned into it, and I like practiced in the mirror, like getting all my like face is down, I like the head motions. Like I loved growing up. I love Lucy, and so like I'm thinking of like Ricky Ricardo, playing as Babalu. So anyway, I did that on national TV. That was my first stint. Didn't win the competition, but had an interesting time. And me and my fellow participants, we just had a great time, kind of laughing at the ridiculousness of the whole thing.
Yes.
And then the second opportunity was I moved to Western China, which has far fewer foreigners. I began in the Northeast, moved to Western China, and got word. I had a foreign friend, who knew a Chinese producer that was wanting to produce a travel TV show with a foreigner, and I needed some money to come to New St. Andrews. I knew I was going to go to grad school, and so just called up the producer and said, "Hey, I've got some TV experience,
and I'm foreign,
playing a cowboy, and I'm a foreigner. How about we do this TV show together?" So we ended up doing that, and I would travel around, mainly the province. We went to a few other provinces occasionally, but they would take me to different places, and that the idea is there's this clueless foreigner, doesn't know anything about China, and he's experiencing Chinese culture for the first time. And so I played that up and didn't know anything, and led to some kind of crazy experiences. But
yeah. And is a province like the size of a state?
Yeah, you can think of it as a Chinese state. The provinces are generally bigger than American states, but yeah.
What's the deal with Chinese New Year? What's the difference there between regular New Year and Chinese New Year? I feel like it's always celebrated in the middle of February.
Yeah, so our New Year is based on the solar calendar.
Mm-hmm.
Theirs is based on the lunar calendar. So
so
it changes every. In comparison with the solar calendar, the Lunar New Year date changes every year. But you're right; it usually falls around February. Like in the coldness of winters when you celebrate the Spring Festival. I always think that's so funny.
Yeah.
But that's their biggest holiday. It's their Christmas.
And they have like different years are associated with different animals.
Yes.
Where does that association come from?
That comes from the Chinese zodiac.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac. And in fact, the kind of standard way of asking, kind of figuring out how old somebody is, you don't ask them when they were born, you ask which zodiac they belong to, which animal they belong to, and then you can kind of calculate about when they were born.
Huh.
It's just a roundabout way of finding out how old somebody is. I am a rabbit.
You're a rabbit.
Yes.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the Americans do the zodiac thing, but it's not nearly as good as that.
Yeah.
Our zodiac thing is stupid.
Yes.
That's funny. I didn't know there were 12 animals. I thought it was kind of infinite animals.
Yeah, no, they just keep rotating the animals.
They rotate.
Yeah.
That's funny. How does the Chinese education system stack up against the American education system?
So in some ways it's far superior. In some ways it's far inferior. So, because it's no secret that, Chinese students are great at math. There's a hilarious picture of like the U.S. I think it was last year maybe won the math Olympiad, and like the whole team is Chinese.
I think I saw that, and like the top comment was like friendly fire.
Yes, yes, and it's not just math. The Chinese education system is very rigorous, and for better or for worse. So Chinese students, first of all, it's important to note that in the Chinese mindset, your hope of a future all rests on going to a good college where you can get a good degree to get a good job. And to get to a good college, you have to pass the college entrance exam, which is the most important test in China. All of K through 12 education exists simply to help students do well on this one exam. So you can imagine the pressure that students feel the day of that exam. It's lots of suicides. It's really, really, really bad. And this has actually roots in the Chinese classical tradition, where which is traditionally in Confucian ideology, it's a meritocracy. So you only those who go into government earn it. They have to prove their abilities, and they do that by taking this exam, and so this is just a kind of a modern iteration of that. But for that reason, all of Chinese education is test preparation of public education, and because parents want to ensure that their kids get into the best school, they will require their kids to participate in that. All the schools have these after school study sessions and whatnot, so they get burnt out like you can't imagine. It's school from 8 a.m. to 9 or 10 p.m. It's just school all day long. It's quite common for children they have dormitories for elementary school. Really common for middle school and high school, where kids just live at the school. They don't even go home. They get to go home maybe like once a month or something like that. It's just school nonstop. And if you ask students who've gone through that system, like most people just hate it, as you can understand. But that does mean that these students can take tests really well. They can outperform Americans on just about any test. And so it's very prescribed. Certainly not. They don't emphasize creative thinking. And again, there's advantages and disadvantages to that. But in the Christian education, classical Christian education, like what they're trying to recover is sort of, first of all, seeing education not just as test preparation, but as soul formation, and so it's still, when you compare it to American schools, it's still ridiculously rigorous, but they are trying to take away, like, whereas American classical Christian schools, we're trying to up the rigor.
Yeah.
In Chinese Christian schools, it's trying to reduce the rigor, so that kids have time to go walk in the park and play and so on and so forth. So the challenges facing classical Christian schools there are quite different than the ones facing here. But I mean, they're sharp. And they like to make fun of Americans
for being dumb.
Yes.
Which is maybe accurate.
Yeah. I mean, we're dumb. And our schools are, our public schools especially, have a lot of room to.
Well, we certainly don't spend 8 to 10, 8 o'clock a.m. to 10 p.m. In school.
Nope.
At any time, really.
Nope.
Maybe sometimes in college, but yeah. As far as your approach to technology and privacy, China is extremely, as you mentioned, surveilled. Have you implemented things in your online life over there that kind of tried to maintain your privacy that you brought in over here as well?
That's a good question. So, when I first went to China, any missionary, if you have any, especially any interaction with like if you're part of a mission organization, they will go to great lengths to warn you, for example, code all of your messages about anything related to Christianity, use code words, use VPNs, use burner phones and fake emails and so on and so forth. Very, very cautious. And so I when I first went to China, I did that. But very quickly I discovered, first of all, local Christians generally don't do that. And it prevented me from being able to really embed myself into Chinese churches.
Interesting.
The vast majority, I can't say this is the case for other countries, but in China at the time, now very, very few mission organizations are doing any work in China. They've all been purged. But at the time, basically every mission organization that was doing work in China, their policy was don't go to a Chinese church, if you can imagine that. They want the foreigners you can start their own sort of fellowships, foreign fellowships or whatever, and you can invite Chinese people if they want to come visit, but basically keep yourself separated from the Chinese church. The idea is you don't want to endanger them.
Right.
But in my experience, that's not helpful, generally speaking, because what the Chinese need most at this point is not some foreigner to come in and plant a church. There are already churches there. It's the shepherding, training of clergy, of Christian education. Like, you need to partner with them to help them, empower them to start these schools and so on and so forth. And you can't do that if you're not going to their church. And so I gradually began acting kind of just like them. When I would contact a foreign colleague, I would go out of my way just so as not to, if you send them an email and you mention, hey, I'm praying for you or something, sometimes someone get really freaked out. Oh no, he mentioned pray. I probably set off alarms in some center somewhere and they're going to come to my door tomorrow. And so just to avoid that, I wouldn't mention that to foreign colleagues. But when I'm talking to Chinese, I would use all of their same spiritual language, and we would plan meetings in different places on social media. Now, when the big crackdowns happened, after I was kicked out, around the time I was kicked out, there's this renewed crackdown, and you did find, and you still see Chinese Christians, conservative Christians, part of these unregistered churches who are using, for example, Telegram, which is a lot more secure than WeChat, which is how most people talk. And so I adopt that, but I kind of gave up. Like, even when I was being tracked by when the police came and into the church to find me, what happened there was they took copies of my passport. I said, well, I want to go back to finish worshiping, and they said, okay. After worship, I went back to my place, my apartment, and people from the church quickly moved me out of the apartment to a safe house. And they did that a few times. And every time, no matter how careful we were, the Chinese found me.
Yeah.
And and since then I've had instances of Chinese hackers getting into my Facebook account, and other social media. It gets you can become so paranoid that you become ineffective.
Right.
And so at some point, I just kind of said, I don't really care.
You have to take some risks.
Yes. And funny you should ask. I yesterday or the day before, I posted on Facebook a video pertaining to the TikTok ban of a Chinese man, and he's essentially bidding farewell, and he says, "Hello, I'm your personal Chinese spy."
I saw so many memes that were very funny.
Yeah, it's like I'm so sad to see you go. It's been a great 5 years. Keep going. Yeah, and I like to kind of imagine like I have my own personal Chinese spy somewhere, but it's like I really don't care. Not because I don't want to get kicked out of China, obviously, but I've learned that if the government wants to get rid of you, they will get rid of you. Yeah, it's really hard, and so I do care about protecting my brothers and sisters over there, and I usually let them make the call. So if they prefer a lot more secrecy, then I will abide. But if they send me a message on WeChat, I still talk with a lot of them on WeChat about God, and I have no problem doing that. So yeah, it's less of a concern for me now than it used to be.
Yeah. What can Americans learn from Chinese people and Chinese culture?
That's a loaded question.
Yes, it is.
What can they learn?
This is probably a lot.
Chinese and Chinese culture. I think, generally speaking, it's good for Americans to realize the world doesn't revolve around them.
Which is frankly shocking.
Yes. And there is a sense, politically speaking, there's a sense in which it kind of does revolve around them, which is why it's easy to believe the lie that, like, everything's about. I mean, we're few Americans are bilingual. Like, we just speak our own. And,
we speak.
And most of the world, the vast majority of people can speak at least two languages.
And part of it is because America's so big.
Yes. Yes. But I, the most foreign countries think of Americans as proud, arrogant, self-centered, depraved, and Chinese culture can open your eyes to real glory that is not American. Like, there's real glory in America. Like, I love my country, and I think we should resist. There are unhealthy sort of multiculturalism kind of things that we should push against. But Chinese culture, as a Christian, has shown me the vastness of God's goodness and mercy and grace. To see his hand in this foreign history that I was never a part of, that had almost no interaction with Western civilization, and in many ways flourished in some incredible ways. And I think, Americans would do well to recognize that, to study that. And I'm a postmillennialist, and I think for many Americans, American Christian, American postmillennialists lack the sanctified imagination of considering what the world will look like what China would look like when Christ has when the lordship of Christ has become manifest everywhere. It's a lot of us think it just looks like America.
And I'm so excited for it to not be that.
Yeah, and it's not unlikely that someday we'll talk about Chinese missionaries coming to America. But there's a glory that God has given to aesthetics, for example. I mean, there's very distinct Chinese aesthetic.
So beautiful.
Chinese architecture, Chinese paintings are so different from something like you would find Western artists creating, and the instinct from the Americans is they don't understand it, and so you just reject it. Or Chinese poetry, which is very condensed. Chinese doesn't have Chinese language doesn't have meter, like it's not stress is put on different syllables, like is the case in English, and so there's just a lot of foreignness. And even like Western music, like we're really big into Bach and so on and so forth, and there's great glory there. And you listen to traditional Chinese music and it sounds very different, and we just naturally think, it's so far below what we've produced, and we kind of fall into the same mindset as Chinese Christians often, where we say, and that was the non-Christian. If we have Bach as Christian, Chinese culture, this traditional Chinese stuff is non-Christian, so obviously our stuff is better. But herein you see the lack of sanctified imagination. It's like, okay, even if that's the case, and I have serious suspicions about that claim, but even if that's the case, as Americans, you should be asking yourself, what would that look like under the lordship of Christ? And that should make us very excited. And so anytime I'm reading Chinese literature, looking at Chinese paintings, that's going through my mind. It's like I'm seeing the budding of something which, what would happen if that's watered with the water of the gospel? Like, what would this bloom into? And so, since your question is very vague, my answer is going to be very vague. We can learn to see like new facets of God's glory by examining their culture. You can see things that you've never seen before, think in ways you've never thought before, understand language in ways you've never realized before. And that will increase your thanksgiving to God. It will give you a greater passion for seeing the gospel flourish in places that aren't your home, and will increase your love for others. So there's a lot of opportunities that you cut yourself off to when you're solely focused on building your own kingdom here. And I'm all for building your own kingdom here. You have your first obligations are towards your family and your own people, but the church is given a commission, right? Go into all the world, proclaiming the gospel, and it's not just us who are bringing something into those places. It's God through them bringing us many gifts and blessings. So I would encourage any of your listeners who haven't studied Chinese culture, pick up Analects of Confucius, Google classical Chinese paintings, even like pick up a book on Chinese Christian history, see when, the Jesuits, Matteo Ricci in the 16th century, when he enters China, and you see this meeting of Western Christianity with traditional classical Chinese culture, and see all of the incredible fruit that comes from that, and it'll make you a better Christian.
Yeah. The Chinese flavor of Christianity is just as glorious as the American flavor.
That's right. It's different, but it's
just
glorious.
as glorious.
Yes.
Yeah. How can Americans over here help encourage, bless the Chinese brothers and sisters in Christ over there?
Yeah. So it is hard to kind of understand what's going on even for Chinese Christians, like what's going on in China, because the media is so controlled over there. There's a great website called China Source, and they have weekly. They have a few different sections, but they have a one thing called the name is blanking on it. My mind is blanking on the name, but it's a weekly, basically an email that you can sign up for, and it has different. This is a Christian website, different categories for like, national politics, arts, Christianity, and so on and so forth. And they put news articles that are relevant, and they have little synopses of sort of what's happening here. So like, the TikTok stuff, or, whatever's happening. And you can just keep your finger on the pulse of like what's happening in Chinese culture. And so that's where I would start, just informing yourself, like what's going on. So China Source, enroll in their newsletter and start learning about what's happening. And then as needs arise, like pray for them. And I will say, for those who have a greater heart for doing something more, I do think on the whole, the time for Christian missions as sort of church planting in China is for the most part past. There are exceptions with some minority groups, but we don't so much need more church planners in China, foreign church planners in China, or Bible smugglers, but people to come along the Chinese church and train. So training pastors, theological education, Christian education, especially American publishers who are, I can't tell you, I've got a lot of sad stories of American publishers Chinese Christians who really want to translate and distribute their books in China, and the American publisher doesn't want to do that because the profits aren't going to be enough. So like, don't be stingy. If you've got the means, contribute to some of, there's a number of different translation projects going on. If you're a publisher though, please, consider giving your copyrights over to your brothers and sisters, because the harvest is, it's ripe for the harvest. So many hungry souls and so few little access to theological resources. So supporting those efforts, China is still sending over a lot of international students, and that's a great way to, you don't have to leave your home, and you can minister to them, show them the warm feeling when they come over. And most of the Chinese who are coming over here are well-to-do. They're maybe even have parents in the government, so they're not generally going to be the poor, Christians who need the most help. But it's still a great way to love them, serve them, and perhaps influence the next generation of leaders in China for Christ. So those are a few suggestions.
What's your best piece of advice you would give to anyone watching?
Best piece of advice to anyone watching. I could give, as a Christian, especially I guess with, there's with this tumultuous political environment. We're just a day away here from the Trump inauguration.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And there's a lot of talk about China's future, and they're this big threat. And even in our circles here, there's a lot of talk about Christian nationalism and the importance of Christian influence in politics, which obviously Christ should inform our politics. But there's always this danger of letting politics supplant the work of the Spirit through the preaching of the gospel and personal devotion. So my advice is just hold fast to Christ in the basics of Bible study, prayer, worship on Sunday. Pastor Wilson likes to say that's where we do our fighting is on our main. I forget how he phrases it, but the main fighting is done on Sunday worship, singing hymns, and so keep the main thing. That's my advice.
Yeah. Where can people find you and everything else you've mentioned online?
Online, I don't have a big presence online. I'm on social media. I'm more of a stalker than a poster, but I am on Facebook. You can search me up, and if I'm feeling in the mood, I might accept your friend request. But other than that, I do have some videos on YouTube, and have some writings. I've got a book on Chinese, redeeming Chinese classical education. It's called Redeeming the Six Arts, a Christian Approach to Chinese Classical Education. So you can find that, and kind of, if you're interested in sort of the meeting of Christianity and Chinese classical culture, it's a great place to start.
There you go.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jackson. Appreciate it.
See you guys.